Welcome to Differentiation in the Classroom. This is part one of a 4-part series for support for all students in the classroom. I'm your host, Nicole.Karod. I'm an MLTI ambassador. This is my first year as an ambassador, and it's part of a 2-year opportunity. When I'm not an MLTI ambassador, I am working as a 7th grade science teacher at Mount Ararat Middle School. I've included my email address so that if you want a thinking partner or someone to work with you around supporting your students and differentiation in your classroom, please feel free to reach out. I've included the link to the MLTI YouTube page. Here you can find lots of opportunities for professional development, and I will reference some of those videos in my presentation. Here is the bit.ly for this presentation so that you can access all of the links and information on your own. And then lastly, this video will feature Jonathan Warner, a 2nd-year MLTI ambassador, and there is his information as well if you want to reach out to him. Today we're going to be talking about differentiation. What is it? When and how do you use it? Implementation, what are 2 strategies you can try out in your classroom? And best practices, what makes differentiation work well? So let's start with what is differentiation? What is differentiated learning? In a classroom full of students, we find many differences. Students come to us with different behaviors, language needs, backgrounds, interests, and more. Differentiated learning is a response to those differences. Differentiation is guided by general practices such as respectful tasks, assessments that inform teaching and learning, and flexible grouping. Teachers can differentiate through content. Sometimes, if a student has it in their IP, you might differentiate the learning goals. However, this is mostly about how students get access to the information. Differentiated content might look like leveled text, auditory and visual lessons, word banks, and more. By process, this is how students come to make sense of what they are learning. It could be tiered activities, interest-based stations, personal task lists, offering manipulatives, and more. You can differentiate by product. This is how students show what they know and can do. This might look like a choice of the product, rubrics, or allowing for varied work arrangements such as small group or individual. By the environment, this is how the classroom looks and feels for students. This could be flexible seating, routines, and movement. As you're differentiating, you'll want to think according to students' readiness, interests, and their learning profile. Now, let's take a closer look at strategies to implement differentiation in your classroom. Now that you know about what differentiation is and when to do it, let's talk about the why. It increases engagement. It provides extra help for all students. It's an effective use of time, being able to meet with small groups. And there's lots of studies that says that it improves student learning, and I've posted some of those in the notes. So we're going to look at 2 strategies to help us implement this in our classrooms: flexible grouping with stations and personal playlists. So we're going to start by thinking about flexible grouping and rotating stations. This is a form of blended learning, and if you're interested in learning more about blended learning, you can hop on over to the MLTI YouTube station, and on there is a series about blended learning. Thinking about how do I group students? So I've got interest-based, which means that I may poll my students and ask them what they're interested in. Learning styles, I might split groups into kinesthetic learners, visual learners, audio learners. And again, that would probably be a poll or a quiz type thing that you have your students do to figure out their learning styles. Teacher choice, sometimes we know that's necessary. Student choice. Leveled groups, I think this is traditionally what we think of when it comes to flexible grouping. And so that's that taking assessments and the data and really looking at it and putting students where they need a little bit more help. Maybe they're kind of the middle of the road or they need some challenges. And the last one is just randomly assigned. And the most important thing with all of this is that you are making sure that it's flexible. Like I said, this leveled group piece is one of the pieces that I feel like when we think differentiated learning, that's what we think about. But students should not stay in leveled groups all the time, and they shouldn't be in leveled groups, the same leveled groups all the time. You're going to create that feeling that, oh, I'm in the low group, and the kids do know it. So switching those up and having the opportunity for interest or learning styles is important. So we're specifically looking at our flexible grouping with rotations. Students move between activities or stations, and the ultimate goal is that we are hoping to have students' needs met and their interests met, with the idea that the teacher is able to meet with small groups. So where do I start? I start with the types of groups and grouping. So when I think about groups, it's going back to that interest base. Will my groups be leveled? Will it be teacher choice? All of those things that you're going to pick based on the unit that you're teaching, as well as your students in your classroom. Thinking about how many groups. So if you have 10 groups and you have 50 minutes, your stations are going to be rather short. So thinking about the amount of time you have, and then how many groups of students you want to have in your classroom, and then how many in each group. So when I think about this piece, I do feel like 3 or 4 is kind of the magic number. Any more than 4, there tends to be less engagement. And then depending on the activity, you may need pairs, or you may need 3 or 4 in order to play a game or something like that. And then the last one for that part is, what is my outcome? So am I looking to have students ultimately come out with a project and do some project-based learning around this? Maybe they're choosing some of the parts of that they're interested in, and their end goal is a product. Is it that the bulk of the learning will happen in these stations, and that piece where there's direct instruction with the teacher will kind of push that forward? Or is it more that you're hoping for students to have practice around what they've been learning? So this kind of goes in with that type, rotation of stations. Students go around, maybe you have 4 or 5 stations, hence 4 or 5 groups, and then they're going around to each station with so many minutes to visit each station. Maybe it's a whole group activity, and this is again another form of blended learning where you're taking different activities and you are having one activity, and then you're rotating to the next, and then the next. And then the last one is individualized, which we're going to talk a little bit more about with those personal playlists. And then ultimately, you do want to think about your content and what you're putting into those stations. So as you're doing that, what routines can I set up? Do I want to always have one station that's the same, like vocabulary? How can tech help? So where can I leverage that? Can I have students watching a video and using that to take notes? And then I'm a big fan of, what do I already have that I can use? You have things that you've done in the past, you have things that you might be able to find on the internet, and turning those into a station is beneficial for everyone. And then I just created this form here. So I just created this form here. If you want a copy of it yourself, you can go up to File and make a copy. But what this will do is it will give you all the information that we just talked about. So it asks you about your grouping, how many in your groups, what type of groups, all of those things. It even gives you a spot where you can list your students. You could add more rows in order to have more groups. It asks you about the type. It gives you your content, what stations will you have, talks about assessments, and gives you a chance even to have any other notes or considerations that you might have. So this would be useful in just the beginning stages of your planning. Okay, so let's talk about tools for station rotation. So before, I talked a little bit about having a routine around having the same station each time. So for my stations, I always have a vocabulary station, and students are doing maybe Quizlet, where we're leveraging that tech and using that as a form of just practicing like flashcards. I use real live flashcards where students have either made their own, or maybe I have something that's printed out in order for them to cut up and then use. And then there's a lot of practices and games that you can do with this. I've given you a slide deck for vocabulary games. There's things like finger twister, guess who, spoons, and on the last slide, there's even more. I'm going to highlight one of my favorite games, which is finger twister. This is a game where they have to define the word, and if they get it correct, they get to roll a series of dice. So there's 2 dice that you would cut out and create, and the dice tells them what color and which finger to put on the finger twister board. And they keep going and taking turns back and forth defining words and checking their flashcards, and there's a lot of giggles and there's a lot of fun in the classroom, and they're still learning their vocabulary. So I hope this is a resource that you find useful. I also use video in my stations. So a program like Edpuzzle, where you can stop the video and insert questions, is super helpful, can scaffold the student's instruction. You can also use YouTube, which has lots of different videos on different topics and a wealth of resources. I also usually have a game station. I love games, so putting them in a station is a no-brainer for me. This might be an online game, it might be physical games, it might be problem solving or puzzles. And so with my games, often what I'll do is just do a quick search online games for physics or force and motion, or free printable games for force and motion. Whatever your topic is, you can do a quick search, and there's a lot of resources out there. And then there is some time in cutting and preparing. You also want to think about the number in your group. So if you have a 4-player game, you want to have at least 4 kids, or modify it so that it could be fit for 3. Or if you have, it's only a 2-player game, you might want to have 2 games in that station if you have 4 students, so that you have 2 pairs playing, or have a form where they could play as teams. So games are a lot of fun. Self-checking assignments. If you haven't seen pixel art, it is a definite fun kind of thing, both for kids, and I like creating them. You don't necessarily have to create them because there's lots of resources out there. I've linked some Facebook groups where there's lots of free things in those groups in the notes. With pixel art, what you're doing is basically on a Google spreadsheet or an Excel sheet, you have a list of questions and you want exact answers. So there's some parameters there. You're not doing open-ended questions, but you have exact answers. And when students plug in the answers, what happens if they get it correct, the picture will show up. If it's wrong, the picture won't show up. So it's self-checking. Task cards are just what they sound like. They're tasks. You might have a few different task cards with questions on them. You might have activities where they have to read or watch or do an activity, and there's lots of free resources for those as well. Sometimes it's just an answer key for a self-checking assignment. The kid works through a project or a worksheet or an activity, and then the answer key is there for them, and you set up the routine so that they know that after they're done with that, they go check for the practice that they did. And then Google Classroom also has a nice feature where you can set up a self-grading quiz so they can get that immediate feedback. And that's another one of those things where you have to have exact answers. So you do have to have some parameters on that. So for group expectations, this is super important. I set up standard operating procedures or SOPs for my groups. What do I want my groups to look like? How should they sound? How should they look? So really setting that up with your students beforehand so that they know what is expected of them. And then once you've done that, have your kids evaluate their behavior. Is this going well? What didn't go well? And I've put a rubric, one example, in the notes that you can check out. And then the last thing that you might consider too, depending on your groups and your group of kids, is to assign roles. There's lots of different roles. You could have a materials manager, you could have a recorder, you could have a reporter, and there's lots of different ways to set that up. And there's a link here. So some other things to think about with your stations is your stations don't always have to be the same. So what I've done here is I've given you examples of stations that you could have and that students, you could set up routines for students around. It makes it easier so that if you always have a vocabulary station, you just switch out the vocabulary versus switching out what you've taught them to do. And so that's a nice piece. But I don't keep them all consistent. I change it up a little bit, add a new game every now and then. So if I do have vocabulary games or games that I'm doing, I don't give those to the students all the time. The first station, I might give them one game and make sure they know how to play it. And then the next time we do it, I might introduce a second game. And eventually you'll have a pool of games, and you might have a day where you put all the games and they get to pick and choose which one they want to play. But also your stations could be things like worksheets. Your station could be activities or things that they can do independently and they don't need your help for. Because remember, your purpose is to be meeting with students for direct instruction. And then what I try to do is make sure that I've given directions for each station. So at the beginning of a period or even the day before, I might say you're going to do 4 groups tomorrow and you're doing 4 stations, and station 1 looks like this, and give them an exact link or where can I find that link. If it's a game, I might actually go through it with them and have a student come up and model that so they know exactly what they have to do. And then making sure that if they don't know what to do, what is the procedure for that? Because if they're constantly interrupting you during your small group instruction, that negates that whole piece. So let's look at what this looks like in the field. So we're going to hear from Jonathan Warner, another MLTI ambassador, about what kind of things that he's seen in his experiences.
I'm Jonathan Warner. I'm one of the senior ambassadors of the MLTI 2.0 program. And prior to and after my work at the DOE, I am the technology integrator at Cape Elizabeth Middle School. When Nicole was telling me about this work that she's doing, I suggested that we take a look as a real world example at a project that we do at the middle school called the Ancient World Unit Exhibition. And students at the end of the project bring parents and other younger students in to learn about the research that they've done on various ancient cultures. And the teacher divides these into fashion and culture, art and architecture, science and math, and politics and government exhibits. As they're working, they are first given the opportunity to choose one of those. So they use a Google form to select and rank the topics that they might be interested in, and then to also identify potential partners. So our first tool here is the Google form. Then once those are established, we have 2 or 3 people per group, and I'm representing those there with these shapes, and the teachers begin this rotation. And in this first example, they might have one set up for YouTube flipped learning about the various projects or subject matter that they want to explore. We have one that's working at researching how last year's was run and setting up the parameters and sort of the invitations and the logistics for that upcoming one that they are working on. Then we have a research and citation mini lesson led by a librarian. And then finally, the teacher is offering an analytical writing tutorial for anyone that needs support in that area. And could do that in a really small group because the other students are engaged in these rotations. When they move, I showed these as filled in, but we have the yellow star here representing someone who needs more time or a group that needs more time with the flipped learning and the YouTube playlist. Here we have an expert who has begun to develop or demonstrate a real skill with the research and citation piece, and they can become a peer tutor or a student-to-student teacher. Then we have someone that's demonstrating, or a pair that's demonstrating real strength in organizing the upcoming project. So they might remain at that table for the next series of groupings to do some more research and to share with the incoming people what kind of work is expected of them for preparation. And then finally, someone might stick with the analytical writing tutorial to learn more about that particular skill set that they may need some more support for. I wanted to reference Cult of Pedagogy and suggest that you all take a look at that as a resource just in general. But Kareem Farah has a fantastic article. When I searched station rotation, the article looks at how grouping can create self-paced classrooms and offers some real advantages to that, which Nicole has mentioned. Talks about ways that you might structure the learning as a must do, should do, and aspire to do. And then talks about how that expert student can really help other students gain confidence and gain skills. The article link is here, cultopedagogy.com, self-paced-how-to. And then I thought I'd just show you a couple images from the night. Here on the left-hand side are students who have come in, younger students who have come in to learn about the ancient cultures. They have a Tutankhamun's tomb this particular year, which was incredible. You got to walk in and walk through it. And then you can just see parents learning from the various exhibits about the research. So hopefully that's a good example of how this might all come together and some of the tools you might use to make it work. Thanks.
Thanks, Jonathan. I saw a lot of really great things. Interest-based learning, where students got to choose those groups, and variety of groups so that their groups weren't always the same, as well as teacher-directed small groups. All great things in our flexible grouping and stations. What a great example, and I'm sure the students were very proud of their work. It's something that I would love to go and see. So let's move on to another strategy. We're going to talk about personal playlists, and this is just one way of doing personalized or individualized learning. There's lots of different ways, and I'll give you some tools to discover some of those things, but we're going to look at a personal playlist. So this is really giving the students, empowering the students to have, here's your learning, you're going to walk through it. So that might look like a checklist. Here are the tasks that you have to complete. That's at its simplest form. And that could be something that you're physically giving them. It could be something that you're putting on, a different format. A matrix format is one that I've used in the past, where if you check this example out, you've got your learning targets and you're listing all the information that students need to know. You've got input resources. So this is the learning. This is what you need to do to learn the information. And then I want evidence. I want to know, do you know it from the stuff that you did? So over here, they had to do something where they matched something. They had to do a sort, putting stuff in their notebooks. Even as far as, like, we had a station where students would come over and they would do their cheek cell, and because this is all around cells, and look at that and do an activity. And then the final piece of this is that check-in. This is where the teacher is more involved, where they're doing a check-in. They're checking, do I know this? They're proving, kind of like the assessment piece. And once they've done all of that, they've moved on. So this is self-driven by the student. It's not the teacher that's choosing the pace. The students are working through this at their pace in order to do their own learning. And then as a teacher, you're a guide, or checking their work, or facilitating activities so that they can be successful. And you might have some kids that are on this first goal. You might have kids that are on the third goal. You're really presenting this where they're doing their learning on their own, and you're a facilitator versus the holding of the information that you're releasing to them. And lastly, it could be delivered on a learning management system, LMS. So this might look like Google assignments. So in your classroom, you'd set it up so you have several Google assignments that go with the unit, and kids need to finish certain things or do activities in order to push their learning forward. It might look like that matrix format where they are having a Google Doc and they're able to highlight or check things off. It could be a physical checklist so that students are checking off things as they go. What's great about this is it can be modified for students. So when you need it, you can pull out information, you can add in activities, you can say, I'd like you to come meet with me today, all of those things, because again, you're the facilitator. You are not giving direct instruction to a whole group. It's giving you that time to meet with students and check with students. So this slide's going to look familiar because these are all activities that you can add to your personal playlist. You can have kids do vocabulary. It might be that in there they have the activity of meeting with a buddy and that they have to find a buddy to play a game with. It could be individualized or individual where you have just the Quizlet. You could be doing videos, again, games. You could have them meet with a group that's at their same level or at their same place on the playlist. It could be self-checking things, group expectations. Again, this is a little bit different because you're setting it up for personalized learning. So having students think about, how do I move along? What do I do if I need help? How do I find resources? Where is all that information? And really tracking their progress and reflecting on it. How far have I gotten? Oh, maybe I wasn't doing what I needed to do. So I've got to change that so that I get my learning in. And then under other, I've put a giant toolbox for personalized learning with lots of different links, other ways to do it. Like I said, this playlist is just one way of doing personalized learning. So those were two strategies that you could use to implement this in your classroom. But let's look at some best practices that really make this successful in your classroom. So I emphasized this before, but it's so important. Set up your expectations first. What do I want kids to do? How will you give them the directions for the stations or the parts of the playlist? Set up those routines. If you always have a vocabulary station, this is what we're doing, and practice it. Take the very first time that you do stations, make it smaller so that it's only you're in stations for 10 minutes each. Maybe you don't even do all the rotations, but the kids get to see it. And then after you're all finished with the rotation that day, stop and say, what went well? This is what I really liked you doing. All of those things are going to set you up for success. And you need to let the kids know, this is what I expect of you while you're doing stations. Be proactive. So a lot of the times with differentiation, we think of this as, okay, a student didn't do well on assessment. What am I going to do now? And rather, differentiation, that's reactive. Differentiation should be proactive so that you're planning ahead. You're thinking about, what am I going to do to help these students? Then you're implementing the strategy that you've chosen. You're assessing, and then doing it again with new data. And that's that piece that's so super important is the assessment. So using assessment to move forward, whether that is an exit ticket, a check-in at the very end. I like to call it check-in versus quiz. I think kids freak out a little less. And just quick formative assessments that you can give to students so you have that data, you can collect it, and then you can look at their groups and say, okay, these groups are working, this isn't, this student has the information, this one doesn't, so we need to move, and being flexible with those groups. That's ultimately what you want to do. I love this quote from Carol Ann Tomlinson, who is a differentiation guru. And she says, assessment is today's means of modifying tomorrow's instruction. And that's absolutely true, of looking at, what do these kids know and how do I change the instruction or the stations or their groups based on that information. We're going to end with, how will you implement this in your classroom? Are you the person that's going to dig right in and use the strategies and tools that we discussed today? Or you might reach out to Jonathan or myself about differentiation in your classroom. We can be a thinking partner and help you to implement this into your classroom. And once again, here is our information. Thank you for listening today. We've included our email addresses. So if you want to reach out and check in and have a thinking partner or someone to help you implement these strategies in your classroom, we would both be excited about working with you. I've included the bit.ly for this presentation with all the links. Make sure that as you're using that, you're also looking at the notes in each slide because there's a lot of information and resources in there. And then make sure that you check out the description of the YouTube video for your certification credit. Thanks again for listening.